Okay, back at it one more time. Hopefully, this will be the last one for week for day two. We'll talk a little bit about bridging that divide from classic realism to more modern neorealism, and it does harken back to those great debates, which I told you last time were a little bit overblown. But the idea is that we're moving away from those classical theories that were based upon introspection, looking into human nature, looking into the human soul, that you have with more political philosophy, into a sort of a more what they talk about as the behavioralist turn, right? They have these behavioralist theories based upon objective scientific study, and so I always imagine it. The image that pops to mind is people in political science departments kind of donning white lab coats and trying to study things objectively in almost like a laboratory setting, rather than being the the sage on the stage with the big bushy hair and sort of pontificating on philosophy and morality and the unknowable elements of the human soul, right?
It's a fool who looks for logic in the chambers of the human heart.
Or the human heart, I suppose. And so Morgenthau kind of transitions us into excuse me, this more modern era. Um, and probably the best example of this new approach to what's known as structural realism or neorealism is this guy here on the right. His name's Kenneth Waltz. Neorealism is an interesting term. Neo, I always used to think meant new, like the Matrix movie. New Neo means new, uh, but it took me some time to recognize that neo doesn't mean new. Neo means old. Neo means, in particular, a return to something old. You wouldn't need a neo prefix if it wasn't something that had already begun or had already happened before. So realism is not a new realism; it is a return to an older realism, but one that has certainly some new nuance to it, to be sure. Um, so Ken Waltz, he was a professor at Harvard for many years. He passed away about, I don't know, about a dozen years ago maybe. And his obituaries, one of the ones that really stuck with me was somebody said that he was one of the most influential international relations thinkers of all time, because pretty much everybody writing in international relations for the following 40 years since he wrote his theory of international politics in 1979, for the following 40 years was trying to prove him wrong. And say what you want, but that's a pretty good legacy, I think, if you want to talk about impact. If everybody is trying to prove you wrong for 40 years, that's says something about the staying power of your ideas. Um, anyway, so that's Ken Waltz. Everybody has known him for a long time. Um, but it's worth really quick just kind of stepping back one step before we get into his theory of international politics. His first book, which was based upon his dissertation, was called Man, the State, and War. And I think it's useful to recognize that before we move on to his theory of international politics. But what he does in Man, the State, and War is that he um, differentiates between different, what he calls levels of analysis. Three different levels of analysis where you can look for potential explanations for geopolitical outcomes, right? And so he says, the first level of analysis is the individual, or human thought processes, or human nature, right? So a lot of those classical theories that want to ruminate on the human heart and the human soul, those would be first level of analysis sort of things, right? Um, or if you wanted to, for example, try to explain the end of the Cold War, if your explanation has everything to do with Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher and Helmut Kohl, those are individuals, right? And you can make a very good explanation as to how the Cold War ended by focusing just on those individual level explanations. But that's different from explanations that would come at the second level of analysis, which would be about the state, which is about the type of government and institutional factors, right? So if your explanation about the end of the Cold War turned not so much on individual leaders, but was about the battle of economic systems between the communist Soviet Union and the capitalist West, or the dictatorship of the Soviet Union, authoritarianism and democratic systems in the West. Well, that is a second level explanation, right? That's a completely, and you can make a very good explanation for the end of the Cold War based upon just that. But the third one, and this is the one I think is the most important for our purposes, is what he talks about is the international system. You can look at the international system as a potential area for explanations for different political outcomes. And so the way I always conceive of it, the international system is it's almost like a billiards table, right? And so old timey billiards, but without not a pool table with the holes and stuff like that, but no holes, no pockets, but it just the idea of like breaking a set of billiard balls, and then they start bouncing off each other, right? And they bounce all over this thing, and they bounce off each other in very predictable ways. If you know the momentum, and if you know the angle in which they're hitting, you can kind of predict how each of these billiard balls is gonna come out. And so that's kind of how I envision how he approaches the international system. Is that we can understand it. We don't have to know about the individual leaders, and we don't need to know if they were dictators or Democrats. But we can tell a lot about international politics just by understanding how the various billiard balls of international politics kind of smack off, into one another, right? So that's kind of the focus there. And so he says, okay, this ultimately becomes known as structural realism because his focus is on that international level, that the structure of the international system. And he's very concise in this theory of international politics. It's a very short book. It's very expensive. It's like $80 bucks, but it's only like 170 pages. Very thin. The guy made a lot of money, I think, on this thing. Anyway, he argues that the structure of the international system that determines the behavior of the units within that system. And the units within that system are the states, right? And so he says the structure, if we need to understand the structure of the international system, we have to understand a couple different things. One is what he calls the ordering principle. He says, of course, international politics, the ordering principle is one of anarchy, right? Talked about this before, how domestic governments, their structuring, their ordering principle is hierarchy, right? We don't have that in international politics. We have an anarchic world system. There is no overarching government, and that produces the security dilemma, right? This idea that since in an anarchic world system that you can't trust anybody else to come to your aid should you need it, all countries must then prepare to defend themselves. And this is what is known as a self-help system, right? And the focus, and I highlight this and I underline it, italicize it, that the focus for structural realists is on relative power. So it's a realist theory. It's focused on power dynamics, but it's that power relative to other states, right? And so it's a zero-sum game. So if you think about these questions of is China rising power? And it's like, okay, well, if your understanding is that if China's power is rising, then therefore the United States power must be declining because there's only so much power to go around. Well, that's a relative power analysis, right? And we'll juxtapose this later against absolute power. But for the moment, just think about relative power. That it's a zero-sum game. There's only so much power in the system. So if somebody's gaining power, that means somebody else in the system is losing it. So the structure consists of the ordering principle. It also consists of the units within that system, right? Which he talks about are states. And he says, okay, these states, they are what he talks about as unitary rational actors that pursue their own national interest. So let's unpack that, right? They're unitary actors, which means that we don't have to think anything about what goes into them, right? So if you imagine, again, take the billiard ball analysis, that you've got all these different countries and they're going to be bouncing off each other. We'll have one ball called Brazil, and we'll have one ball called Russia, and one ball called China, and one called the United States. And we don't have to look inside them. We don't have to know what makes them tick because they are unitary actors. They're just one actor, and they're gonna bounce off in particular ways, regardless of whether they're a democracy ball or a dictatorship ball or I guess in American politics, if they're a Republican ball or a Democratic ball, it doesn't matter according to this conception, right? So they're unitary actors. They're rational, which only means that they do if you take economics courses, rationalism is just a decision making process that you take if you're confronted with a question, you think through all the potential alternatives, you do a cost benefit analysis of each, and you choose the alternative that gives you the highest, what they talk about as expected utility, that gives you the greatest outcome, right? That's all that rationalism is. And in terms of how they make those decisions, they focus on, quote unquote, the national interest. That for me has always been a huge weakness to so much foreign policy analysis and international relations theories, is that what is the national interest? Who determines what the national interest is? Right? It's one of these things that gets conceptually stretched to the point where it doesn't mean anything anymore, right? So I mean, you could think of a million examples. Let's take Ukraine situation, right? So nowadays we've got a war in Ukraine against Russia. The United States' role in this under the Biden administration has been to arm and supply Ukraine with military weaponry and humanitarian aid and all this stuff, because it sees it in. People could say this. Well, the Biden administration sees a solid Ukraine as a bulwark against Russia to be in America's national interest. And you can say, oh, okay, that makes sense. But we just had the previous administration, the Trump administration, was trying to essentially hold Ukraine hostage over Javelin missiles unless he would dig up dirt on his opponent, right? So the national interest of the Trump administration, and for whatever reason, has been overly laudatory towards Russia, towards Putin, and suggesting that that Russia is in the right. So it seems, just in that quick anecdote, that there is something going on at the domestic level, that there is a difference between a Democratic administration versus a Republican administration in these particular cases. And so who is it that ultimately determines what the national interest is? That's my problem with a lot of these arguments, is that national interest just means whatever you want it to mean. And if it has no meaning other than that, then it's pretty much pointless. It doesn't have any explanatory leverage if it can mean anything and everything, right? Anyway, so for Waltz, however, in defining the national interest, he says there are two things that go into it: survival and power. Right, power, obviously, it's a realist approach, but survival is the predominant thing. Right, his argument is that since we're in a self-help system, since nobody can be determined or can be relied upon to come to your aid, the first thing that any state must do, and any state leader must do, is maintain and make sure that it continues to exist into the future. That is just the baseline. You have to maintain your existence, you maintain your survival, and then anything above and beyond that is accumulation of power. But you have to be able to so anyway, in this structural realist approach, the structure is the key, right? And so it's a unidirectional explanation. It says ultimately the actions of any state is not determined by anything that comes from within. It's not about internal forces. It's not about Democrats and Republicans, dictators or dictators or democracies, right? It's the system itself that dictates the behavior of the units within that system. It's one direction, and the structure is everything. So you have the ordering principle, which is anarchy. You have the units, which are states. And then you have the distribution of capabilities, or the distribution of power within the international system. And so when you hear about people talk about, the Cold War was a bipolar system where the relative power of the United States and the Soviet Union were equal. But before World War One, you had a multipolar system where you had the relative power of, France was equal to England, or excuse me, Great Britain was equal to that of the United States, it was equal to that of Imperial Russia, and so on and so forth. And then after the Cold War, people talk about this as a unipolar moment. That's all about the concentration of power or the distribution of capabilities within a system. So, so if the structure just consists of those three things, the ordering principle, the units, and the distribution of power, he says you can actually formulate a number of things that come out of this. And so the idea that all states are looking to pursue their security at all costs leads to very predictable so-called balance of power behavior, which is just the formation of alliances that are driven by the fear that a more powerful side is pursuing additional gains. And so if we had time, and I'm pretty sure it would be cut straight out of the YouTube version of this. One of my favorite, I'm a Monty Python fan, the Archaeology Today sketch, that Monty Python did, it's where they essentially equated power with height, and you had these archaeologists who were trying to get taller and taller and taller by putting people on each other's shoulders, until they go into battle at some point. It's funny. It's very, it makes more sense to watch it rather than have me describe it. But I'm sure due to copyright, it won't make it through. Anyway, he says that this is ultimately what's going on in the international system. He says this is what's going on, even though the leaders of countries, even though the states may not realize that's what's going on or that's what they're doing. That's what they're doing, right? They're balancing power off against one another. So, and he says, alternatively, it's possible that instead of balancing power off against one another, that you can do what they talk about as bandwagoning, where states opportunistically side with the stronger power in the hopes of gaining the spoils of victory. So you think about like the first Gulf War back in 1991 against Saddam Hussein. Even Saddam Hussein's closest allies, which at that point included the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, as the Soviet Union was falling apart, nobody wanted to back Saddam Hussein in that particular war because they knew he was going to lose, right? So why don't we just ally with the United States and in the hopes of gaining some spoils of victory afterwards? So, but it's never really clear, how you determine whether or not you're going to balance power or you're going to bandwagon in these cases. So. Anyway, I'll move forward. I'm going to click through this the video.
All right, Eversley, get up out of that.
So let's talk a little bit about the pluses and downsides of structural realism. Obviously, the advantages, as we mentioned before, everybody for the next 40 years was trying to disprove, Ken Waltz on this, and so one of the advantages of this is that it's a very parsimonious explanation of international politics. And parsimony is a great word. It just means that it explains a lot of what goes on with very, very little input, right? Very simple assumptions. And therefore, it makes it very easy to use, and it produces very, very predictable results, right? And that's the challenge.
Well, that was easy. Yeah, I guess it was.
Kind of easy to do, right? So I mean, if you're a structural realist, and there are a couple of them out there, like guys like John Mearsheimer, the idea is that, okay, well, if you have a question about international politics, if you're worried about, again, the rising power of China, is that a challenge to the United States? All you have to do from that perspective, you don't need to know anything about China. You don't need to know about the Chinese Communist Party, or you don't need to know about Xi Jinping or anything about that. You just have to know about those three things, right? You need to know about the structure of the international system as anarchy. You need to know about the units, our states. And you need to know about the distribution of power leading to this balance of power behavior. So it's like a very easy to use computer that you just plug in these things. It gives you a easily generated outcome. So from that perspective, yes, if China's power is rising and power is relative to one another, that means that power of the United States is declining relative to China, and that's concerning, right? So that becomes a very easy to use, very parsimonious explanation. The downside is that it leaves out too much, right? There are no international organizations in in Ken Waltz's. So there are no IOs, which is the focus of our class. There's no international law. To the extent that there are, in realism or neorealism or structural realism, they use it as epiphenomenal, which is another great word, but it just means that they're like window dressing, right? So you can say that, yeah, you've got an organization that you call NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and they're there to balance power on the American side and the Western European side against against the Soviet Union. But is that what's really driving what's going on here? Is it really the organization, or is it this balance of power dynamics, right? So maybe it's just epiphenomenal. Maybe it's just the window dressing of the organization. But what's really going on once you look beyond is this balance of power dynamics, right? So it leaves out a lot. It leaves out international organizations, international institutions, international law. But also, it's very, very difficult in this system to explain change within the system. It's very simple, but it's also very rigid, right? So the idea is that, okay, think about the variables that we have in here. One is the ordering principle. Well, the ordering principle is anarchy. It never changes, right? It's anarchy now. It was anarchy 1,000 years ago. It'll be anarchic 1,000 years from now, according to neorealism. So how do things change if the ordering principle is always the same? Second, you got the units. The units are states, and they're always conceived as being states, right? And so, yeah, we may have more of them, right? We may get a South Sudan. We might get an East Timor every once in a while, but the states are still states. They haven't changed at all. And even the distribution of power within the system changes glacially, right? Think about it. You had a multipolar system before World War I. And then by the end of World War II, you've got a bipolar system. By the 1980s, 1990s, the Soviet Union collapsed. You go from a bipolar to a unipolar system. And so there you've got, in the process of, 200 years, you've got two changes in the distribution of capabilities. You go from multipolar to bipolar, you go from bipolar to unipolar. How do you explain change if everything in the entire system is static? It's very, very difficult to do so. And so, so these are some of the critiques that have been levied against structural realism. And for our purposes here, as we're wrapping up, this video for today, the focus on the lack of international cooperation, which is what international organizations and international law ultimately are, is one of the big sort of Achilles heels for structural realism. But to the extent that it's kind of at arm's length from studies of international law, you still see a lot of challenges levied against the study of international organizations, levied by people from a fundamentally structural realist approach, even today. And so it's certainly far from dead, and it is important for us, I think, to know moving forward. And that's what we'll do. I guess we'll do a quick addendum to the structural realism. We had neorealism, but we also have neoliberal institutionalism. And this neoliberal institutionalism also, with the neo, goes back to a previous liberalism. So in some cases, we can talk about going back to those interwar liberals. You can go back even further to Immanuel Kant, whose treatise on perpetual peace kind of presages what we talk about as the democratic peace proposition, that if we're going to ensure world peace, what we need is a world of constitutional republics. And this becomes the foundations of this so-called democratic peace proposition. The finding, as they say, that liberal democratic regimes do not fight one another, which is about as close as political scientists ever get to agreeing on anything. It seems that there is something about the way that democracies work, something within that mess that realists would stuff inside the black box, that is having a clear and consistent influence on war and peace. What goes on inside the black box matter. And so that's kind of what we're talking about when it comes to these the neo-liberal institutionalists, which was key towards sort of understanding politics in both the Bush and Clinton administrations back in the 1990s in particular. So It's important for foreign policy too, right? So, anyway, so neoliberal institutionalism. When back in my day, when I was first taking international relations classes back in the 1990s, this was the extent of it, right? There were two basic approaches. You had neorealism, and you had neoliberal institutionalism, and it was like they were two peas in a pod. I mean, they weren't all that different. So neoliberal institutionalism essentially copied everything from neorealism. So they had the same basic assumptions of structural realism, the same basic rational choice things, right? So they agree with Waltz that states are the main actors in international politics. They are unitary actors, that we don't have to figure out whether they're democracies or dictatorships. We don't have to think about what goes on inside the black box. And they're rational. They do the cost-benefit calculations. They choose the outcome that gives you the highest expected utility. Plus, they agree that the system is anarchic. System of international anarchy, that there is nothing above the level of states. But they're trying to figure out how we can explain cooperation in this international system rather than just conflict. And so this could be the result of the end of the Cold War. But thinking about how cooperation is possible in a system of anarchy.
Uh-oh.
Oh, minions. I always just thought it would be fun to have that as a backdrop. Anyway, so here's the way that I can best explain this difference between neorealism and neoliberal institutionalism. The argument that they make is that cooperation is possible, not just competition, but cooperation is possible in this system of international anarchy because states are actually pursuing not relative gains, but absolute gains, absolute power. And so the best way I can explain this is with a kind of a 2x2 box here. And to try to talk about it this way, right? So imagine, dramatic oversimplification, that we're about to sign a trade deal, we being the United States, right? We're going to sign a trade deal with China to build tractors that will facilitate the building of tractors on both sides. Tractors are great, and not just because I'm from Iowa, right? Tractors are a good proxy for power, right? Because tractors, you can have economic power, right? The more tractors you have, the more mechanized your agriculture, the more grain and harvest that you're able to do. So that becomes a proxy for economic power. Plus, if you need them, and this is true in the old former Soviet Union, is that they would retrofit old tractors, put tank tracks on them, and use them as tanks, right? So you could use it as a proxy for both economic power and military power. That's why I like tractors. Anyway, so imagine this, right? So we have, before this agreement with the United States and China, the United States has 1,000 tractors, 1,000 units of power, if you will. China has only 200, right? So across the top row there, we have a ratio of 5 to 1. Again, dramatic oversimplification. But the United States is 5 times more powerful than China, looking at it in that particular light. Now, if we ink this deal with China, the anticipated outcome will be that the United States ends up with 2,000 tractors. And China will get 1,000 tractors, they'll get 800 tractors. They get 1,000 in the end, right? So ultimately, the United States gets 1,000 new tractors. China only gets 800 tractors. But that 2 to 1, we have 2,000. China has 1,000. That's only a 2 to 1 ratio, right? So the question then is, knowing that this is the outcome, do you ink this deal, right? So if you are a neorealist, you look at that far right column, though, that ratio, and you say, no, you do not ink this deal. Look, we're 5 times more powerful than China beforehand, and afterwards we're only twice as powerful as China. So China is getting more power relative to us in that particular case. So no, we would not want to ink this particular deal. If you're from a more absolute gains, absolute power perspective, from the neoliberal institutionalists in particular, you would say, look at that bottom row, right? The United States, we go from 1,000 tractors to 2,000 tractors. We are better off in absolute terms. We double our better offness, right? We double our utility. So, and if China goes, and gets 800 tractors, well, good for them, right? That's great for them too. So this looks like a win-win. Why would we not want to do this, right? And so obviously dramatic oversimplification, but this is kind of the logic of how even in the system, not everything is as doomsday as the neorealists would suggest, because they suggest that not all states are focused on relative power all the time. In many cases, they're looking for absolute gains, absolute power, and that can explain a whole lot of the international political system. So ultimately, the neoliberal is the focus on domestic politics. That's the element part of it. But also there's this institutionalism, and this becomes very important for our study of international organizations, because international organizations are effectively institutions. Institutions, by the way, is just a generic term meaning rules of the game, right? And so we have rules, bureaucracies. That'll become a big part of this class later on. But neoliberal institutionalists suggest that cooperation, which can be encoded into treaties, they can be encoded into international law and international organizations, that's possible through these international institutions that are established to help states achieve those absolute gains, right? So those institutions are the formalized rules of interactions that facilitate cooperation between states. What do these institutions do? Well, there's an entire literature out there, right? They say that, well, these institutions, they provide information about states' intentions, about their actions, about what the distribution of gains would be, right? So if you establish something like a League of Nations, and you want to have your representatives of all these countries, and it sounds like, Absurdistan over there is looks like they're clamoring at the border. Well, let's call in their representative, to the League of Nations, and ask them, get the information, right? So institutions can help provide that information, right? Institutions can also reduce transaction costs, reduce the costs of doing business. This is a great thing we'll talk about later on for like global organizations like the World Trade Organization, right? So the idea is that we had one standard for tariff barriers and have this most favored nation status, and it makes a lot more sense to have that and say, okay, if you adhere to this particular set of standards, you get this particular outcome in terms of our best deal in most favored nation trade status. It makes a lot more sense. It reduces the transaction costs of doing business instead of having the United States negotiate a trade, an entire slate of trade deals on every single product that's out there with Canada, and then renegotiate everything with Mexico, and then renegotiate everything with El Salvador, and renegotiate everything with Colombia, and with Brazil, and with Argentina, and so on and so forth. So the idea is that just having it in this one-stop shop can actually save you a lot of time and effort, which they talk about as transaction costs. Plus, it helps to make the commitments of a country much more credible, right? That if you are a member of an international human rights organization, well, that gives your your pronouncements, I should say, on human rights a little bit more weight. Shows that you're kind of talking the talk and walking the walk. It also helps to establish what they talk about as policy focal points later on. With the Barnett and Finnemore book in particular, we'll look at how things like the World Bank, is a great policy focal point for, fomenting economic development in lesser developed countries, right? And so if you want to know all the stuff that goes in when it comes to development, the World Bank is a great place for that sort of thing. So, and finally, they talk about, and especially this comes out of rationalist studies of war and Cold War in particular, but they can provide the so-called shadow of the future and provide strategies to facilitate cooperation. So this goes to game theory, which we'll talk about a bit next week, in terms of making sure that if you have repeated interactions and expectations of repeated interactions with an opposing country, the United States and the Soviet Union back during the Cold War, you're not going to, defect from your agreements with them based upon the recognition that you're going to have to encounter them again and again and again on down the line. And so those are some of the big elements that come into neoliberal institutionalism, especially as we're juxtaposing it against neorealism. And I think I'll wrap it up there now.